Hi, I'm Anthony Clarveau. I wrote The Living, the play that's going on right now. So, The Living is set in the plague in London in 1665. It was a response on my part back when I wrote it many years ago, um, both to the crisis in this country around AIDS, and also as a native San Franciscan to the earthquake that we'd had in 1989 and what that had done to the community in the Bay Area as well. Hmm. Hmm. Sure. Uh, the When I wrote The Living, I was looking around for something that I could adapt to the stage, and came upon Daniel Defoe's novel, A Journal of the Plague Year, which he wrote in the early 1700s, but was about the London plague of 1665. He wrote it as a kind of a warning, because the plague was coming again. He wanted people to know what had happened before so that they could learn uh, from the lessons that had been gained the last time around. And as I read it, it felt so powerfully resonant with so many of the questions that we were facing in this country at that time, that happens when you're dealing with an epidemic. How do you treat people humanely? How do you keep a sense of community when everything is telling you to keep apart from each other? What's the role of government? What can medicine do? Is there a role for religious faith? How do you keep people believing in the science, especially when the science is new and unsettled? All of that was in the original situation that Defoe was writing about. I ultimately decided not to do an adaptation of his book, but to actually go do primary research into the original documents from that time and learn that story directly from the voices of the people who had lived through it, which was a very powerful experience and really gave me the feeling that they were passing their experience, their story along to me to pass on to whoever wanted to hear, around the lessons that we are still learning about how to treat each other in the middle of a disaster. Okay. Right. I Clearly the play is striking a chord. It's being produced a lot around the country virtually right now and elsewhere. It always has been. It's weirdly for something where you'd think is that's not an easy thing to watch necessarily, but it turns out that actually it's my most produced play. It's been produced, I think, 50 more than 50 times now around the world. Um, in different cities, in different times and places, in Japan in the wake of Fukushima, in New Orleans in the wake of Katrina, in Florida in the wake of hurricanes there. Um, Whenever a community is trying to figure out how to tell a story about how a community reunites in the wake of a disaster, whether it's an epidemic or whether it's a natural disaster or something else, um, it seems to be one of those useful stories, and I'm glad I had a chance to pass it along. Now here we are in in our pandemic, and one of the things that's been really striking was when I wrote the play. One of the things that was very moving to me was accounts of people in London at the time who felt unsafe approaching each other. They didn't know how the plague was transmitted. And so it led people to keep a physical distance, social distancing, as we would call it now, from each other. It led to quarantining. It led sometimes forced quarantining. It led to a lot of fragmentation of the society. And so I put that on stage by insisting that none of the performers come within arm's reach of each other. I meant it as a metaphor at the time. And now it's just become our literal reality. So it's been very striking to see how that especially has resonated. And of course now we're doing the play by way of Zoom or other online platforms, and the fact that the performers are not even in the same room with each other a lot of the time, just it seems to work in the same feeling of the risk of alienation and the sort of the yearning for connection that we're all feeling at this time. Yeah. um, to me, the character in the play that I find most strangely moving and that I connect with the most is John Grant, the statistician. He's one of the founders of population statistics, and he reported on the plague in London. There were surveys that were kept. The different parishes in London would keep a record of the births in the parish and the deaths in the parish and the cause of deaths in the parish, and they had for many years before the plague, just as a matter of record keeping, even at a time that there was not really a census of the English people as a whole. There did exist this in London, and it was just this great body of what we'd call data now that nobody had really done anything to analyze. And he had the fantastic insight to say, if you look at these statistics, the term barely existed at the time. Week in, week out, you could actually tell a story of what diseases were rising, what diseases were rampant, and where they were spreading, because you could track it from parish to parish. And so he tried in vain over a number of years to pass along to government the fact that they had this information. They had what we would call a data set all ready to go. And information there to be learned from. And he was honored. He was named a fellow of the Royal Society, a great honor for a scientist at the time. But nobody took his advice. And so he's a bit the Anthony Fauci of the day, I think. Is an advisor to government officials who really don't want to hear what he has to say, because it would require taking action, being leaders, and spending money. And so that notion of somebody who also then thinks he's there in a community just to be an observer, but who finds himself drawn more and more into the situation on a human level, knowing more people, seeing more of the pain and loss involved, takes him beyond the numbers, takes him beyond the science into the humanity of the situation, and he finds that he isn't just observing, that this is something he's living in. So I find his character very moving, and the other character who was so moving and powerful to me was Sarah Chandler, who is Grant was a real person. Sarah Chandler is a composite of the experiences of a number of people that I read about or who were reported on. Somebody who thought of herself as somebody whose family were small merchants, sold candles, and a wife and a mother, whose husband falls ill and dies, and who finds herself now having to scramble to make ends meet, to make a living, to either get out of London, or to somehow exist in London, and finds herself, as many people do who didn't have the training, but who found the need, serving as a nurse in plague time, at tremendous risk. And for her as well, this is somebody who really just wants to be exempted from this whole situation. If she can lie her way out of it, if she can say that her husband died of anything other than plague, so that she isn't ostracized, so that her family isn't quarantined, she's going to do that. And if she can get out of London by pretending that she hasn't been exposed, she's going to do that. And time again, she finds that the things that she's trying to do, don't work in letting her escape from the situation that she's in. And then finally she has to become heroic despite herself. And that constructing a character like that without having known before I began that hers was going to be the experience of the play that was going to carry through from the very beginning to the very end. That was a remarkable surprise and a very powerful experience for me as a writer. Yep. Yeah. Right. Got it. So one of the things that was striking to see in this story from hundreds of years ago that felt very resonant with me and people that I knew at the time that I was writing the play, and I think still does, is that the losses that you experience in an epidemic aren't just about people getting sick and people dying. It really is about the loss of community, the loss of connection, a mistrust of each other, the loss of intimacy, the inability to trust each other's bodies, and the inability to be with your own family. There's a scene in the play where Sarah finds herself locked out of her own home, where her family is being quarantined, and this happened a lot. Any household where anybody was infected, people were just locked up. They would just nail the door shut and essentially leave them to die. And in finding herself outside that home, she's unable to reach her family. And so many of us right now, we're dealing with this experience of, especially with our older relatives or other family members who are particularly vulnerable, that we literally can't see them. We can't be close to them. You can't hug your loved ones. And that's a powerful cost to an experience like this. And another whole level of loss, I do think is any time something like this happens, it does expose the fault lines in a society. It exposes the places where government is not being truthful or not taking effective action, where the country's budgetary priorities are, who gets protected, who gets treatment, who gets tested, who gets safe places to be, and who doesn't. So this plague was referred to even at the time as the poor people's plague, that disproportionately the people who sickened and died of the plague in 1665 are exactly the people who are turning out to be most vulnerable now, what we would call essential workers, people whose jobs required them to be physically present in a dangerous workplace, as opposed to the kind of people who were in the investment class or in the ruling class, who could maintain their place in society while maintaining a distance from a lot of other people in their estates or their second homes, their country establishments, whatever it may be. And so those people just abandoned the city of London and left the people who couldn't afford to leave stuck there to survive as best they could. And that just feels so much like what so many of us are going through right now. And it felt like what we were going through in the Bay Area during AIDS, and what we're going through along with everything else we've got happening right now with the natural disasters that we're experiencing in this state. A real sense that there is not a deep commitment on the part of the federal government, particularly the executive branch, to the care and good health and representation of the people in a community that they don't feel is part of their base. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I am, I mean, obviously, I wish this play were not relevant. I wish we were not experiencing the very thing that is making theater artists respond by doing this play. That said, given that it's happening, I'm glad to be able to contribute to the conversation in what I hope is a meaningful way. I think of all of my plays, it's the one best suited to virtual production by dint of the fact that the actors are forbidden to come close to each other so there's virtually nothing lost to the staging by having the performers appear in a lot of separate rectangles on your screen. Certainly compared with other pieces of mine. And I have had a chance now to see several of these Zoom or other online platform versions from Boston to Seattle to Texas to a number of different ones, and that of course is another thing. Is these are presentations that, in the normal course of things, at this point, given the age of the play, I wouldn't see. I wouldn't even necessarily know that they were happening until I got a report from my publisher after the fact. And so the fact that I'm actually getting a chance to see how different companies of performers in different communities and different directors and even designers, to the extent that design is possible in this context, to see how they are making use of the script to communicate what matters to them in this time in their particular communities, not just sort of America, but what resonates in Boston, what resonates in really interesting. The production in Texas, a number of those folks were first generation, and the fact that there is in the play a minister who is speaking for people who are being disenfranchised, who are being deported from their society in the midst of this crisis, spoke very powerfully to them in a way that didn't happen as part of the production in Boston or in Seattle. They had other issues that came to the fore for them. And I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't been able to see that and then talk with those people as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Fair enough. I'll have, I can riff on this theme. I am delighted that the living is being produced in this way, in this time, in my home community, in the place that inspired it in the first place, decades ago. Here it is again, and I hope still serving this community. I love the fact that this is being performed by people who literally were not alive when I wrote the play, and yet they are finding ways to connect with that. It feels like it is another passing the story to another generation who is passing it along. It feels like something urgent to say in this time, in our situation, and I'm glad to be, providing the language to do that. Sure, happy to. And now Joy will help me upload this thing, and we'll see if we have to do that all over again. Thank you, Brianna. Thank you, Christine. Hi, Joy. I'm turning off my phone now.